Hello, everyone, and welcome to Municipality, a podcast exploring the wonders of local government through discussion and special guests. For today's episode, Matthew and I are here to talk about the current situation around the defund and abolish the police movement. We'll be here to give some context of what's happened and what is happening, and specifically Madison and Minneapolis. And hopefully we can discuss our thoughts on the topic and what's coming next. It's great to have you here, Matthew.
It's a pleasure to be doing this episode with you, Natty. And, you know, this is a really important issue that I think has been on many people's minds for decades, right? But it's really been put into the eye of the public very recently. And just like on a personal note, some ways that I've been involved I've been a member of the City of Madison's Public Safety Review Committee since last December. And we'll probably talk about this a bit later in the episode, but with the events of this summer, our workload drastically increased to the point where we went from not even meeting at all during the pandemic to meeting several times a week and forming a police budget subcommittee, a protest policy subcommittee to really analyze the city's policies and the police department in ways that we can influence the Common Council and also provide input to the public as well. And then obviously with my role in student government here at UW-Madison, we've really looked into the university's police department, questioning whether it's even needed and why they felt the need to spend tens of thousands of dollars in suppressing student voices at protests with purchasing munitions and all types of things. But kind of before we go into it, like I also do want to acknowledge that like as a white male myself, even though I've been involved in efforts to fight the corruption and the current state of policing, like I'm also not being oppressed at the same time. So I just wanted to recognize that as well. And it's important, I think, that those with privilege acknowledge that and realize that our allyship is really important because just recognizing that and ways we can elevate where we're at to broaden this movement.
Yeah, for sure. I feel like you and I probably have a similar experience in that I grew up never feeling unsafe around the police whenever I saw police lights on the highway or whatever. It never was a thing that really freaked me out because I think growing up you see the images of kind of like the police character on TV, or that's kind of, it's never seen as something scary, but also I think that for me changed this summer for a lot of people. But my first experience was actually at Sunrise GW when we had a GW PD officer violently push a friend of mine down the stairs like 2 feet away from me. And I'd never seen anything like that in my life because obviously I had a lot of privilege. So I think it's really important that you bring that up. And I feel like, as you've mentioned, that the summer kind of was this pivotal point where I think even people with privilege couldn't ignore the fact anymore, or it was brought their attention and it was something they couldn't really unsee. And so I assume when you started this committee, you said that there was not a lot of workload. So was it really just when the murder of George Floyd happened that everything changed? Or was there even before that some type of push for, reform in policing in Madison?
Right. And before, I have to say, our chair, she really has a good perspective on all this. And I could see, looking back, was pushing for reforms. And if you look at, her track record, she was a former alder, had done that. But I think it took the public and other committee members the events of the summer to realize that this work is really important. And in the past, the Public Safety Review Committee, I was looking at past agendas uh, before my time on the committee, before the time our chair was on the committee, and literally the entire meeting was just the police gave a report and the fire department gave a report, and that was pretty much it. And now we have discussed and voted upon a civilian oversight board to oversee the police. We voted on a proposed tear gas ban, which ultimately failed at the city council. And we right now are discussing facial recognition technology, and that'll be at our next meeting. And in the police budget subcommittee, we actually made a report, like a over 40-page report on the police's budget. And then we had a public hearing where members of the public could come give their thoughts on it. And right now we're working on some recommendations to provide to the Common Council. And that was like one of the first times the public had a comprehensive document that outlined the police department's budget in one like I said, in one document, like that had not been provided before. So I think George Floyd's murder and Jacob Blake, Breonna Taylor, all of this is not new. Like this has been happening, but I think it took, like, I don't know if COVID-19 had an impact in drawing people's attention to this because they were not as transfixed in their previous lives as they were before. But I think public opinion has recognized there are flaws in the system. And like you, like I grew up in a predominantly white community. I would say I never had any reasons to not trust the police in that community and had really good experiences. But, you know, also recognizing again, it's a predominantly white community, generally affluent. And I think that the entire system of policing, if you look back on it from the very beginning, it's been structured on white supremacy and was literally created post Reconstruction as a way to enforce racist policies and suppress recently freed Black people. And then if you look at the formation of police in the contemporary urban cities, it was again a way to further that effort, further those efforts in supporting white interests. So just kind of wanted to mention that too, is if people look into the history of policing.
And just a very subtle plug, if you're interested in learning more about that, our other municipality member, Adrian, and I did an episode 3, on the history and future of policing. So if you haven't heard that one yet, because you're a little bit newer to municipality, I would recommend listening to it as well. But you actually took the words right out of my mouth. I was going to talk about how this really isn't the first time that this has happened. I think there have been multiple cases of documentation, but I think the murder of George Floyd, there was just something about it, the context of it. I don't know. I think that's something people will kind of go into at some point in the future and try to really analyze why this was such a pivotal moment. But I think what you're outlining is that it's fundamentally changed the conversation forever. And so even if people are discouraged about how much has happened or how little has happened and how it always feels like there's inaction, I think that in a lot of ways the conversation has fundamentally changed. And so that is exciting to hear about. But I think it's really cool to see you partaking in all these personal changes in Madison and using your privilege to help people, because the thing is, it's not fair that you didn't grow up with that fear and other people had to, or experience that, have a different life experience that they weren't able to, walk freely and not be afraid of, getting stopped by the police. That should be the experience for everyone because they're supposed to be there to protect us, right? And so I know that we've talked quite a bit about Madison because that's mostly what Matthew's doing, and we have a lot of current information on that. I was just going to mention a little bit about Minneapolis because I think it's important to look at the city of Minneapolis as kind of a little bit of a marker of what's happened so far, because I think Minneapolis is kind of the epicenter of this. I think as someone who's living very close to Minneapolis, I could definitely feel it, and even though I wasn't going to the protest because of personal circumstances, I could still see and feel the presence of everything that was going on nearby me. And so I think it's interesting to look at what has happened in Minneapolis. Minneapolis is a very predominantly blue city, kind of in a purple state, but we still have a lot of federally elected blue senators and House of Representative members. And even having a blue mayor, there's been kind of a lot of stops. We for this episode, Matthew and I actually did some research and looked at how the city at the beginning of the summer voted 12-0 to remove police from the charter and pledged to cut the budget. And then we read some more recent articles where certain city council members felt that there was confusion of language, backing out. And since public support had been down, there was kind of a sense that they were going to change it or maybe make it less of an aggressive move. And most recently, the charter commission voted 10-5 to take another 90 days to review the proposal of the language and look at the details of it. And basically that means that it won't be something that citizens of Minneapolis will be able to vote on in this election. And it'll actually be at the soonest possible time this could be voted on would be 2021 November. So this has already pushed another year back. And so it's kind of devastating in some ways that in a city that we had a 12-0 vote and had complete support of the city council, that still little has been done. And currently there's budget talks. And I have a strong feeling that I don't think there's going to be significant cuts to budgets because I think Matthew can talk to this more, but we've been seeing across the country, even in light of everything that's happened, police budgets have not really in any substantial way been cut. Other budgets have been much more significantly cut in cities and municipalities, right? And so I think it's interesting to look at Minneapolis, and we'll have the links below of some of the articles that we were looking at. But Minneapolis is kind of this epicenter as this blue city that could have done it. And even then, like losing that public support. And so I think it's interesting to also look at Matthew's work in Madison, which is also a college town, and see how even there things are kind of slowing down. Would you say that's the truth? Like, I know that things have forever kind of changed in the context, but it seems, at least from my point of view, public support is like, oh, abolished, that's a little bit of a strong word. There are some good police. Like that narrative, I feel like is coming back again.
Yeah, and first, before we go into that, I wanted to thank you for sharing what some of the context with Minneapolis. And, I think that's a very interesting community to study because that's kind of the epicenter of the public movement to defund police departments or even abolish them. And also, I second listening to our first episode that Natty and Adrian did about the history of policing because it definitely opened my eyes to many things. But to answer your question, I think that's really interesting, and I wanted to note that the mayor of Madison actually introduced her executive budget for the operating budget a few days ago, and every department in the city was asked to take at least a 5% cut, except the police department only has $2 million in cuts, which is not even close to 5%. And their department is over $80 million, which is about 25% of the general and library fund, which is the city's largest fund, largely driven by property taxes. But I think it's interesting that these progressive people run for office, but then when they're faced with these actual decisions, they're not making them in the manner that you would expect. And I think public opinion is it's interesting because some of the very people who in the summer I saw were sharing uh, posts about the problems of police departments and the problems of funding. I want to note to some listeners who may have strong feelings about law enforcement, I'm not trying to criticize people whose careers are defined in this genre, in this field. I think we need to look at it systematically, and that it's past just somebody trying to make the community safer, but how other people feel about it. And I realize I went on a little tangent, but back to the performative activism element, the very people who are saying there's problems with police, they're overfunded, when they're put in a position to actually make that change aren't. And I've seen that with our city council and with our student council. We recently did a vote of no confidence in the university's police department because they were not complying with the 8 can't wait policies that I think many people agree is a good thing. Obviously, it doesn't go far enough, but I think it's a good starting point. And they also provided chemical munitions, as I mentioned, and other military grade weaponry to Madison police during the protests. So we said we don't have confidence in this department, but many people opposed our push to do that vote. The very same people who may have been protesting in the summer, who were posting things on their Instagram stories. So it's interesting to me that there's this soft power that law enforcement has over people where when it comes to actually making the decisions, they're either intimidated or afraid. And I've noticed some tactics they do, such as intimidation, gaslighting, manipulation. I realize I went on a complete tangent, but to answer the original question, yes, I think when people hear the buzzwords defund and they hear abolish, I think that makes many people scared and confused. What exactly does this mean? When in reality, it's saying that is it really ethical for 1/4 of the city's budget to go to a police department, or can that go to affordable housing? Can that go to public services, transportation, measures that actually increase the safety of a community and then limit the need for police in the first place? And when people say abolish, I think if you really look closely, it's not saying, okay, we're going to live in a lawless society. It's redefining what the police are and is saying this system is not working. So let's find a system that does. And something that the city of San Francisco, I found out actually, I saw this yesterday, a lot of they have transferred the care, and actually let me find the exact wording, but they've transferred the care of um, for so for example, they are now deploying unarmed teams of professionals from fire and health departments to handle calls related to mental health or behavioral crises. So these are people who are professionally trained, but they're not carrying a gun. They're not police. It's a fire department. I think that is something that could be a broader discussion, expanding some of those types of services to being covered by mental health professionals, by fire departments, etc. So that theoretically would fall within abolishing the police because you're abolishing something they've been previously doing and you're transferring it to a new program.
Yeah, and I agree. I think the example that I always give, which may be a little bit of a tangent, but I always say like pro-life is always going to be a better slogan than pro-choice. It's really hard to be like, I'm not pro-life. Like, well, how can you not be like, it's a hard thing to argue. So when you say like abolish the police or defund the police, I feel like it always it will always be missing something because a catchy name won't encompass all of that discussion. And so I think that it's hard to get people to not be freaked out by that. I think in some ways people kind of were like, "Oh, we gotta get rid of the police," and then they started thinking more about it, and then they were like, even though I think some of them probably understand that it's gonna need to happen in some way, or there needs to be some significant change, I think people are scared of, like, a complete removal or a complete abolishment. I think that level of change freaks people out because they think that it's radical when, like, the reality is that this is no longer radical in a sense that police reform and change has needed to happen since, like, the very beginning because there has been a disproportionate like I guess police have disproportionately hurt certain communities and helped other people and have not applied the law necessarily equally. And so I think in some ways police kind of have that nostalgia factor for people who were protected by the police, people who maybe had childhoods similar to us where the police were kind of that friendly local character. You're like, there's no way that they could be hurting people like this because that's not my experience. And so I think that affects the way that people are able to rationalize with the movement. And I think that I understand why people feel that way, and this podcast isn't in any way supposed to be, like, making fun or, ignoring the fact that some people really do believe in law and order and want that kind of policing, but I think we can all agree that there are issues with it, and it's not perfect, and it's not attacking the individuals necessarily who do this work and truly care about making the community safer. I think we can all agree we would love to have people who are really passionate about their jobs continue doing that kind of work, but it's impossible to ignore that the system that has them in or the current policing system in some ways makes it so they're unable to do their jobs well or kind of taints the ones that really do care about what they're doing or care about keeping the community safe. But um I guess to continue also on your tangent about San Francisco, I didn't know about that. That's really interesting, and I feel like if people knew that abolishing the police was that, I think people would have a different perspective because people definitely do think the idea that it's somehow like laws no longer apply because the police aren't there. Like, do the laws still apply in your house? Like, there's no police there. Not like so. It's kind of a fallacy the idea that the police equals the law, and so it's cool to see that though cities are taking those kinds of steps to really change the way that we help and serve our communities, which is exciting.
Right, right. And I feel like also there there's a lot of power that comes with police unions, and I think to an extent that has caused many elected officials to carefully consider their votes and their views on this matter. Like, for example, in Wisconsin, Act 10 basically dissolved and gave zero power to every union in the state, with the exception of police and fire unions. I think that was very intentional, and they have a lot of influence. And I think a lot of elected officials are feeling that. And, kind of back to what Natty was saying, is it's great to have people who are passionate about their jobs, but then we have to ask ourselves, when the police, who are primarily dealing with people who are harmed, who have mental health issues, who are homeless, is having someone with a gun the right person to do that? Like currently in Madison, an inventory summary that we received on our budget subcommittee from August 2020 listed some of the items the police department has, and when I read this, it sounded like they are a mini military unit because they had uh, a total of 7 drones, 3 Harley Davidson motorcycles, 23 total 40 millimeter launchers, other interesting devices as well that we can link below that was really telling, honestly. And like from the 1033 program, they're able to get actual military weaponry for free, only paying for the cost of shipping. Some of those items included ballistic goggles, tourniquets, spectacle kits, 500 flex cuffs, 6 boxes of mask respirators, Regan Scouts, one PackBot 510. Not really sure what that is, but sounds scary. 40 firing attachments, all sorts of materials where you question, is this, that police officer walking around the neighborhood, do they need that? And I think that's also something we have to ask ourselves. And in what city are they needing to have those devices on a daily basis, right? And I think that's something, again, that we need to consider in this discussion. And I also wanted to mention, too, when we were talking about things potentially slowing down and Natty providing the example of Minneapolis, how many leaders are kind of singing a different tune now as we are entering budget season. Even with among us students, they have tried, the UWPD has tried to slow down our work by publicly calling out critics on Twitter, by accusing people of saying one thing in meetings and saying the other, personally calling students on their cell phones, all tactics that are done very intentionally as a way to separate the issues we're advocating for and the ones who are advocating for the issues. And what I think a common tactic is making us individuals, public critics, people who are fighting for a better tomorrow. They want us to feel like we're the ones to blame. We're creating these issues. We're leftists. Some have even said we're communists. So I think those are all tactics to take away from the problem that people are dying at the hands of the police. Like, police brutality is a real thing, and we can't deny that. And people then equating activists with looters, two different things. So I just think that people need to really look between the fine lines and really understand the nuances and the semantics behind why there's even a movement in the first place. Because if people were having good experiences with the police, if people were not dying, there would be nobody in the streets. Like, people have jobs. Many people are students. Like, nobody wants to be protesting. Nobody wants to be sitting in meetings with police to try to reform the system just because people may feel like it, right? Like, it's intense mental labor and creates so much social anxiety to do any of these things. And there's a reason why people are doing it, not just because they want to disrupt, so.
Mhm. I think for me, I'm gonna talk about anthropology for a second. If for people who don't know, I'm majoring in anthropology and I'm currently taking a class on like environmental, like, or anthropology of environmental like policies, and we talk about this concept of like or slow death or slow violence, and how in a lot of ways environmental racism and like all the institutions in a lot of like our of the Black communities and Latinx communities and other marginalized communities, indigenous communities here in the US experience really intense slow violence and slow death. They are either poisoned by chemicals, they are mistreated, they are basically pushed into a way where their only way out is through activities that we've deemed are criminal and are bad, and then punish them for doing the only thing they could do to either protect their family or protect themselves. And so I think we see, generations and generations of people who've experienced this level of violence from the system. And the thing is, I think people with privilege slowly more and more are standing up and realizing that something needs to change because it's not ethical, it's not right. And so I think there are people who are always going to try to stop change, but I think that ultimately what we're seeing is that young people, and even not young people, but people are just trying to do what's right and try to help these people in whatever way that they can. And I think it's great that there are many people like you, Matthew, who have that level of privilege that are using it to try to make things better. And despite that there's intimidation and, those huge systems and taking down a huge system is scary, because the thing is, those institutions have existed longer than you and I even combined, and even longer than that have existed on this earth. And so it's a very scary thing. But I think, again, as we've seen with George Floyd, like, really people can make a difference, and there has been a shift in the conversation. And I think maybe this year we won't get everything, and it sucks, because the thing is, we should have gotten this decades and decades and decades ago. And it sucks that we haven't gotten it, but maybe there'll be a little bit of a push, and there'll be a little bit of push here, and hopefully things will be changing. Like, we're seeing this kind of stuff in San Francisco, which is exciting. And maybe you'll be able to be successful in your movement, Matthew, and like hopefully make some changes in Madison. And maybe Minneapolis will actually pass that referendum next year. And so it's just, the thing is, I think ultimately what I've taken away from doing movement things is that you have to continue, even though it's hard and it's long and it's a lot of labor. It takes a lot of time and space to try to organize things and try to figure out how you can do this kind of stuff. And so it's just kind of trying to be kind to yourself, that you're doing what you can to help others, but also, continuing the fight, not just giving up. Taking breaks as you need, for sure, but continuing the fight and doing what you think is necessary in that moment. And, it's hard and scary to stand up to those systems, but I think it's really amazing to see so many people now, especially on social media, even if it's quarantine, even though people are in quarantine, like, seeing people take that action. I think in a lot of ways, for people like me who are at home, not at university with my peers, it makes me feel a little less alone, that I'm part of a bigger movement doing this kind of cool stuff. But I don't know what your thoughts are on that, Matthew.
Yeah, honestly, everything you said is, I think, what so many people are feeling. And the system as it is inherently unfair. And I think this could be a broader discussion on even a different episode, why certain people benefit while others don't. And I mean, I think it's important that people make their voices heard, and the system relies on tiring people out to stop activism. Because, like we both have mentioned, everything that's being brought up right now is nothing new. Like, this has been brought up for years and years and years. And the way the government works, it's a bureaucracy where change takes years. It took, for the Civilian Oversight Board, which, for those aren't familiar, is a new citizens oversight board over the Madison Police Department, which is run or staffed by an independent auditor who will be assisting in overseeing disciplinary matters related to the police department and a whole slew of other oversight measures, which I implore you to look into. The Civilian Oversight Board, City of Madison. Super interesting. We actually voted on it at the Public Safety Review Committee. But with that being said, those efforts came about as a result of Tony Robinson's murder years ago. And it's taken over 5 years to get this up and running. And it is just getting started to allow citizens to oversee their police department, to have community control. And I think that this work is really tiring. And again, I can't imagine what it's like not being a white person who's fighting at the same time while also facing that oppression. So I think it's important that people realize that the system relies on us getting tired, facing public opposition, being called out to stop these efforts. And it's really important we stay strong. And those of us like myself remain allies and use the privileges that we have to help those who don't. And like, I see this will be an issue for over 30 more years. Like, I don't know how much longer until change is made, but I think if we can, as a young generation specifically, continue advocating for these measures, maybe we can instill these values in the generation to follow us. And then it's all about changing the culture. So
Yeah, I couldn't second that anymore as an anthropology major, but like, that's the inside of my brain. I think it also makes me think of Brian Bedford, which I know is a very close friend of yours, Matthew, but when he was on the podcast previously, he made me feel, and I think I can't speak obviously for the other people that were there, but I can assume that he made them feel very special, but also like the work that we were doing was incredible, and that you could tell that he was disappointed that he wasn't able to make the changes that he sees us trying to push for now. And so the thing is, though, it was very nice to have someone on our side and kind of say, you need to keep going. I know it's hard. I've been trying this my whole life and I know that it's going to take a lot longer, but I'm so glad that you're still trying and seeing people like we interviewed in that episode. I think she was 17 or 18, so she was even younger than I am, and like started her a first like protest. And so it was cool to see that kind of stuff, and it's cool to see that out of this movement so many people have come forward and have tried to step things up. And I think another thing, talking about that privilege that we both have, is that I think that we're always learning. I think that I've made plenty of mistakes in my past and I haven't always known what's right and wrong, because we are all affected by the culture that we live in. I think we are all products of the science and the history and whatever that they teach us. And in anthropology, they call it like a social fact. And we all are kind of, I guess, brought up believing those social facts until they're proven wrong. And sometimes it's harder for us to see it because it's a reality that we don't have to live, which isn't fair. And so I think another part of this experience is like trying to do your research and trying to learn. So whether that's discussing with people, whether that's discussing with other allies, or discussing people who've experienced it, or reading testimonials online or other books, or listening to podcasts like these. Like, I know that this is the perspective of two, non-Black people. And so we both understand that there's some level of privilege that comes with this discussion, but I think that it's more important to have this discussion and try to see how we can be better allies, how we can help better in this fight, and how we can better educate ourselves. And that's really the difference. I think, especially as a lot of cancel culture is, you make one mistake and it's over. And I think that there are some things that perhaps is hard to come back from, but there are a lot of things that people in these spaces, you can tell that they truly want what's best. And sure, we have made mistakes and we haven't always known everything, but that's okay. No one always knows everything. We are a product of, a racist society. It's going to take a lot of unlearning to progress past that. And so it's inspiring to see that so many people are willing to accept people who have struggled in the past, or who haven't necessarily known the right things, into this movement, and are really trying to make change. And I think what you said is right. This will probably take another 30 years, but I think what's important is allies like you and me don't stop fighting because it's no longer popular on social media, or it's no longer popular wherever it is. And so it's important to also take care of yourself, because I think, as we've said, it is a draining process, even as someone who doesn't face the oppression head on. It's a very scary thing. And so it's important to take breaks and take care of yourself. But I think it's even more important to, not give up on this. But I guess kind of more, hopefully as a closing more statement, do you have any tips, Matthew, on how you can get involved in like the local movements, how you can kind of, I know that Madison isn't exactly fully a success yet, like you haven't won what you want to win yet, but I would say hearing your stories pretty often, it's cool to see someone my age be able to kind of push the boundaries of what local government is doing, and push a city to kind of listen to the people in a different way. And so what are your tips on kind of participating in this movement, and what have you found helpful, becoming involved in this?
Yeah, I would say probably first thing you can do is continue making your voice heard, showing up to protests, being an ally if you are one. But another great avenue is, if you see vacancies on any city committees, to apply for them, or if you don't even know if there are vacancies, to reach out to your council member, whether it's you have council members who represent the entire city, or you live in a district, and say, hey, I'm interested in serving on a city committee. Are there any openings? And I think that's a way you can directly insert yourself in the conversation. And many city committees actually vote on things that the Common Council refers to them and really takes up their recommendations and opinions. So that's a way you can have a direct voice in the matters, but also just showing up to the meetings. If there is going to be a vote in your local community on something related to public safety or law enforcement, registering in support or opposition to the agenda item, speaking to the Common Council, writing to your elected officials. Like, many of them do read those things. They do listen. And actually, last night I was literally at the Madison Common Council meeting for like 3.5 hours about this other agenda item, number 58, that we were advocating for. Unfortunately, did not pass. It failed 14-5, which is sad. But it's part of being there to represent the best interests of people. And like, I'll be honest, ever since I've kind of got involved in this work, a lot of people have called me out online, have sent me nasty emails. In fact, I literally got one like 10 minutes ago. So I think acknowledging that there are going to be criticisms, and I'm sure that many people who are listening to this episode right now probably don't agree with everything we're saying. And I think that's important and it's okay. And I think it's healthy to be able to have a dialogue around this and understand where people are coming at and openly disagreeing each other, even criticizing each other, as long as things stay civil. And again, it's done for public discourse and not for vilifying and uh, malicious intent. But if you're involved in this work, I'd say biggest tips is just keep moving forward. Don't get manipulated and stay true to your instincts and your passions and what you believe is morally right. And maybe for those who are against police reform and some of the things that Natty and I mentioned on this call, I would urge you maybe to look into why do you feel this way and maybe whether your experiences with law enforcement have been shaped due to privileges that you may have in your life that may be different for other people.
I think, yeah, ultimately, this conversation is because we think that the well-being of people should be top priority. And I think that's something most people can, agree on, that we just want people to feel safe, to be healthy, to be happy, and be able to pursue their dreams. I mean, that is really a lot of ways the foundation of the, American dream, that kind of like idea. And so if we really truly believe in this, we should be open to having these dialogues. And please, you can, on any of our social media, come talk to us. I'm more than sure Matthew would love to tell you his 12 million stories about local government, because Matthew has a lot. Matthew's taught me a lot, and I think we both learned from each other, but also the other members of this podcast. I think another thing is, if you can't see an opportunity for yourself, like I said earlier, I was unable to protest this summer. I started this podcast. I started doing research. I started reading books. I started talking to people, and I've been really trying to make a change in my life and the lives around me, and that's important too. And so the thing is, it's giving what you can. And I understand that people are in a pandemic and things are challenging right now. And trust me, I understand it so much. And so it's about doing what you can and trying to help in whatever ways you see fit and trying to participate in this process. And if you don't have the time to do what Matthew does, because I don't know how he has the time, you know, trying to be part of these discussions and trying to learn more and be active in maybe a different part of the community or working, but even showing up to one council meeting, can make that difference. And so it's important to just try to participate in the system and try to learn and try to be, better than you were before and help make this a better place for everyone, because that's ultimately, I think, the takeaway from this. And again, we are more than happy to discuss this. I'd love to know what your guys' experiences are in your cities. Maybe you guys have had like some really lucky cities. Maybe you guys have had some really, terrible experiences, or maybe, whatever in between. We'd love to hear about it again on social media. But again, thank you so much though for sharing, Matthew and calling me.
Of course. And thank you to everyone for tuning in for this episode to learn about law enforcement, public safety. Have we even abolished the police yet? Which was the original question. So feel free to reach out to us with any questions or feedback on the episode. And we hope that you will all join us again soon in our municipality.